Thank you again for many that's sticking around going through this study. And again, it's not really that we're going anywhere in particular in any type of real direction, but really mainly just wanting to look at the idea of the promised land and the idea that Israel today, and how we kind of get confused sometimes with that stuff. But we're looking at mainly that the children of Israel will lose their promised land, that God told them that they would be able to inhabit this land as long as they did what God commanded them to do. And we're going to notice that today. We're going to see the idea that God is going to be speaking to them and saying if they do these things, this will happen. If they don't, and we're going to see the fulfillment of these things that took place as we go through some of the prophets, and we'll kind of go through some of that, and then hopefully we'll be able to dig in a little bit more. The idea would be, again, next week we won't be here, but following that, looking at the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, when we're kind of looking at the divided kingdom and some of those events. So a lot of this is kind of dealing with what we sometimes call the intertestament period. We'll kind of get into that, the time between the testaments, and kind of lead us into kind of some New Testament study through that. So we'll just kind of see where it goes. Nowhere in particular that I've got in mind, but we'll kind of do a broad stroke through this. Some of this may be repetitive to you, but it's always good to have a reminder, and especially when we get it kind of in a quick, condensed version. Because I know we were talking in class one day there, and again when we were at school, it was the whole Bible in 2 years, and you think, well, that's impressive, but not so much that. It's everything was so familiar with you because it was done in such a short amount of time that you saw how things began to click together relatively easily. So hopefully through this, doing a quick run. Again, we won't get into every little detail, but trying to hit the high spots as we go through this, getting to where we're at. So now we're going to look today about the Exodus, Moses and the Exodus. So again, we spoke about that in our time there in our worship hour. But again, where we have been at is we have the children of Israel, or Jacob, and the 12 tribes, these patriarchs, and this great, and all these individuals are going to come down because Joseph has been sold into slavery. He is down in Egypt. There's a famine in the land. Jacob and them have to go down there. So this is why we find them in Egypt. So sometimes the Bible student may look at that and be like, well, all I've ever heard about them being is in the land of Egypt, right, the children of Israel. But really they were in Canaan, or the patriarchs were in Canaan, and then they went down into Egypt. So as we made note in our worship hour, that a Pharaoh rose up that didn't know Joseph. So this is important. Exodus chapter 1, looking there when you get into this. Again, this event is taking place. The book of Exodus is going to pick up right after the death of Joseph, and then there's going to be some time, at least some time has passed that, again, this man came up and he doesn't know who Joseph was. He doesn't know all the good works that Joseph had done. And we say, all right, they're going to cause them to be slaves, right? We don't want them to raise up against us. Verse 11, noticing there, again, set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. So this is the life that the Israelites are leading, right? They're God's chosen people, right? Even still down here in Egypt. But they have these taskmasters over them, and they're saying, all right, we want to be delivered, right? We're looking for that deliverer. We look back, when you go back into Genesis, there again at the end of that, Genesis chapter 50, looking there in verse 24, Joseph tells them that God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land unto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So for the Israelites that are down there, they're looking for that. They're saying, all right, we're looking for God to visit us. We're looking for someone to take us out of this bondage. That now, it was a good life that they were living in a sense, but now we're under this affliction, and Pharaoh, he's toiling over us. So we're looking for a deliverer, looking for someone to help us. So, well, again, understanding the idea of Pharaoh and how much to test, and I believe there's some merit to look at the idea of the hard labor to cause the Israelite or the Israelite women to maybe miscarriage, and the idea that Pharaoh told the midwives to abort the babies when they were delivering them, and then he commands all of the nation to kill their sons, throwing them into the Nile River. So this is the type of man that he is, right? He said we have to control the population of Goshen, the children of Israel. So that's why we find Moses saved, right? This was significant with Moses because he was hid those 3 months, or he was hid as long as he could be. And then we say, all right, now his mother can't keep him hid anymore. So she puts him in the ark, puts him in the Nile. So Moses is saved by Pharaoh's daughter and raised in Pharaoh's house, Exodus 2, 1 through 10. So this is important. One, in the aspect of that Moses, when you look at like Josephus and the ancient historians that say, well, did Moses write all of the Pentateuch? You get these critics that say, well, was the Bible compiled by so-and-so? These critics look at these things, but they said that the man that wrote it had to have a good knowledge of Egyptian heritage and ideas of what was going on in the Egyptian lifestyle, the way he phrases things, the way he words things. So we think, all right, Moses is brought up in Pharaoh's house. So he has got this knowledge of the Egyptian background from that. So this is significant that he's raised up, but we understand through the context that he's either told that he is a Hebrew, or he finds out in some way. I think he was told that he was a Hebrew. Obviously, he wouldn't look the same as the Egyptians. So from this, he's going out to his brethren. So that's when we kind of pick up there in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 12, or in verse 11. It says, when Moses was grown, he went out unto his brethren. So it seems like he knew he was a Hebrew. He knew that he was a child of Egypt, or Israel there. I'm going to go Egypt and Israel back and forth all morning, so apologize for that. But that's just the way it is. But we see there, he goes out and amongst the Israelites, and he's saying, all right, this Egyptian was beating my brother. I'm going to save him. He kills him. It says he looks this way and that, doesn't sign anybody, and he ends up killing that individual. He slays him. Now, this is kind of neat. I think when you look at the names and you look at all this stuff, you think, why do we got to know all this stuff? But he flees to Midian. He escapes. Pharaoh is going to kill him after he has killed that Egyptian. And he says, all right, I'm going to flee to Midian. Now, back in Genesis chapter 25 and verse 2, after Sarah had died, Abraham takes another wife, Keturah. So he has this wife, and he has different descendants from that. Genesis chapter 25 and verse 2, we read about those individuals. But Midian, right, that nation would be named after that man. He was a descendant of Abraham. So when we find Jethro, now a priest of Midian, there in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 16, and also wrote there in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 1, we think, all right, well, who is he a priest to? I believe that he would be a priest to Almighty God. Wow, how would he know about Jehovah God? Well, Abraham was his father. So again, if you look at Brother Guy N. Woods, the descendants of Abraham being Hebrews, the descendants of Jacob being Israelites, and those of Judah, and maybe Benjamin being folded into that as well, Jews. So we hear that phrase a lot, Hebrews, Israelites, Jews. And you may not agree with Brother Woods, but we say, all right, any descendant from Abraham is a Hebrew. So again, this being Hebrews, if you want to look at it in that light. So all the Jews were Israelites, not all Israelites were Jews. So again, you'll hear that when you go into the New Testament. They begin to just call them Jews, and we're going to look into that as we continue the study and find out why they began to call them that. So, interesting note nonetheless. Midian, he's a descendant of Abraham. So Jethro, the high priest, or the priest, not high priest, but Jethro was a priest of Midian. So pretty neat, that little nugget there. So again, through the context of what's going on now, right? We're in Exodus. Moses is there. The angel of the Lord appears to him in the burning bush, Exodus 3, 2 through 4. Again, we may note that he calls him to go be the deliverer. He says, you're the man. You're going to go. We'll find all the different excuses that Moses makes, but no, you're going to go. Aaron will speak for you. Which is interesting. He never had a problem speaking and coming up with all those excuses not to go. But he says, Aaron can speak for you. And then from Exodus 5 through 12, again, the 10 plagues that are cast upon Egypt. Again, the idea that they went after the false gods of Egypt. That they would pray to the god over the Nile River. They would pray to the god over the flies, over the frogs, over all of these things. And God showing superior in that. And in fact, seeing that some of the Egyptians left with the children of Israel because they said, all right, we can see what's going on, right? In fact, some of the Egyptians were even begging Pharaoh, this is God. This is not, though Pharaoh's claiming to be deity, he says, we can't do that. So in Exodus chapter 12, 1 through 28, we find the instructions for the Passover meal. So if you are here and you think, well, we partake of the Lord's Supper, where do we get all this, right? Where do we get the emblems? Right here we have it. Exodus 12, 1 through 28, we find the unleavened bread. So this is what we go like passages like Matthew chapter 26, 17 through 18. Matthew 26, 17 through 18 is just one of the gospel accounts that mentions that they partook of the what? The Passover feast. So this is what they're partaking of, right? And that's why we get the emblems that we have today. So we say, all right, why do we have to do that? Well, we've always had it. No, this is kind of where we trace that back to, this Passover meal. It's what they are having. So that's what Jesus would, again, all the Jews, that they would celebrate the Passover, and they would do that once a year. And in fact, when you read John, that's kind of where we get the idea that Christ ministered for 3 years. He's got 3 Passovers. So you can give a good definite time stamp when it talks about a Passover, that it's within 1 year, the 2nd year, the 3rd year, as you go through chronologically through the Gospels. So if you're having trouble deciding when all these things took place, you can look at the Passover feast and kind of get an idea of the time frame there as well. Now, again, Exodus 14, 10 through 31, we have the parting of the Red Sea, right? A very well-known account throughout the Scripture. Moses parting the Red Sea is very significant, as we talked about in our worship hour, the fact that they were in Egyptian bondage. The Red Sea separated them from that. Now they leave from Egypt and they're traveling. And if you go to Exodus chapter 19 and verse 1, they're here on Mount Sinai. So again, this is important for the Bible student that is studying, and he or she says, all right, well, I find myself here at Mount Sinai. I hear about Mount Sinai. I hear about the 10 Commandments, the commandments of God. How did we get all of this in Genesis to Exodus? Now, why are we here in Mount Sinai? Here we are. So what you find is that here's a little bit of the track that they would go through. I don't know how much of it you can see, but essentially coming from Ramesses up here in Egypt, you can see the Nile Delta, Goshen, this area down here where the Israelites would live in the land of Goshen. So they come up and they drop down, again crossing the Red Sea. So this Gulf of Suez is the Red Sea. It expands on that, so don't let that trip you up. So they go down now into Mount Sinai, right there in the wilderness. Now that wilderness of sin, don't let that fool you into thinking this is where they wandered in the desert because of their sin. This was, again, Sinai. You see that S-I-N word in there, the wilderness of sin, Mount Sinai. In fact, the wilderness wandering would be more like up here, wilderness of Zin, Kadesh Barnea being right up there at the top. So this is more likely where they wandered the 40 years instead of down in the wilderness of sin. So if you see that, again, don't get tripped up by that. So this 3 months exodus from Egypt, they've crossed over the Red Sea. They're like, all right, we made it. They're following Moses, and they find themselves down in the wilderness there in Mount Sinai. So this is important. Again, so the Bible student says, all right, Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments. So we don't just get the 10 Commandments, we get 10 of them, but there's a lot of other commandments that are given. And when you read the book of Leviticus, though it's kind of a difficult read sometimes to get through, these are the commands in which they are to follow, right? All of these things. Now, let's jump ahead a little bit here and let's look at Leviticus 26. And this is where we're going to kind of stay put here for just a moment. Israel must obey, right? God has delivered them out of the land of bondage, land of Egypt, and they're coming down. Now, when we go into Leviticus chapter 26, let's make note that they must follow the commands of God. Again, if you want to think about once saved, always saved, this idea of apostasy, as I will call it, the terminology, the state of apostasy, turning back. We say, oh no, if you're saved, right? These are the children of Israel. We're going to find that they weren't saved. In fact, Numbers, we find that generation died because of their rebellion. We're going to see later that the nations are going to be carried away. But notice the blessings that they receive. In the first 13 verses, he says, I'm going to give you rain in the due time, right? We talked about that there this morning in class, about needing some rain, right? It's hot, it's dry. He says, don't worry about that. I'm going to give you rain right when you need it, right? Could you imagine, guys, a farming like that, rain just when you needed it to rain in there. He said, that's what I'm going to give you. He says, you're going to have plenty of food. You're going to be safe in this nation that I'm going to bring to you. Notice there's going to be peace. There's going to be no wild animals. Verse 6, there's not going to be any kind of animals that are going to come in and take away your children. You know, these we think about like the lions and, stuff like that out in that area. Not going to have to be worried about any of those things coming in and taking your children. You're going to have peace. You're going to have safety in that. Not only that, he says they, being the children of Israel, would chase away their enemies. So if someone was to come into their land, their nation, he says you'll be able to chase them away. If you read that account there in 7 and 8, it's interesting, verse 8, and 5 of you shall chase away 100, and 100 of you shall put 10,000 to flight. So they weren't going to be able to stand against Israel as long as they did what God commanded them to do. God would respect them and make them fruitful. There in verse 9, again, all of this in Leviticus chapter 26. God would talk with them. He would be able to be, again, it's this idea. Notice verse 12, and I will walk among you and will be your God, and you shall be my people. Now, he wasn't actually right out there in the midst, but we've seen the glory of God coming into the tabernacle at that time, so he was right there with them. It wasn't like he just kind of gave them the land and said, here you go. No, he said, I'm going to be right there with you as well. This peace, this prosperity that you're going to have in this land. So what we find is that they go into this great nation and they don't really follow it. Now notice, here's the stipulation. If you obey me, if you follow me, all of these blessings are going to come. But now let's notice verse 14, that three-letter word there, but. Notice, but. Verse 14, but if you will not hearken unto me and will not do all these commands, notice what's going to happen now. If you don't listen to me, God's going to cause terror and their enemies would eat their crops. When you read that account, what it's talking about is, I'm going to plant my field, but I'm not going to be around to harvest it, right? I'm going to do the planting, but another nation, right, some other individuals are going to come in and run me off of my place. They'll be the ones that will be eating the crops. Now notice, what's happening to the children of Israel, those who are present here on Wednesday nights? He's driving them out, right, little by little. That way they can have the crops. So the inhabitants of Canaan, the Canaanites, they're planting the crops. The children of Israel are coming in and getting the benefit of that crop. But he says, if you don't follow me, it's going to be the right opposite way. You're going to plant the field. Other individuals are going to eat your crop. Right? Their enemies would slay them. Now, the punishing them 7 times more, really, again, the numbers in the Bible, 7, it could be 7 times. I'm not going to say it's not. But really think of that as a complete time, right? 7 is like a complete number. It's a perfect number. So I'm going to punish you perfectly. I'm going to punish you completely, whichever way you may want to look at, or say a literal 7 times. Either way, it's going to be much more to them. The punishment is going to be given to them. Now, notice some other things that are going to happen. Their trees will not yield any fruit. So again, notice they're contrasting the idea of, okay, I'm going to be fruitful, everything's going to be great. Look at all this now, bringing 7 times more plagues. Again, a complete set of plagues or a perfect amount of plagues to destroy them. We'll notice there, and we see some of that in the minor prophets as well, the wild beast would come in among them. So the wild beast would be run out. They're going to come back. You're going to get pestilence. You're going to be chastised 7 times more for their sins. So again, complete or perfect for their sins, or 7 times more. So quite the contradiction there, or the contrast saying, all right, I want to be blessed. And we make note of this in our Wednesday night class, that's not teaching a prosperity gospel that if you say, all right, I'm going to follow God so he'll bless me, our blessings are in Christ. Our blessings are found in heaven. Right? That's our blessing, that we have a home in heaven today. We don't look at the material as our prosperity blessings of Christ. But for the children of Israel, that's what he's saying. He said, I'm going to do this if you'll just listen to me. Again, same way, I'm going to give you heaven if you'll just listen to me and obey me. So same idea there. So notice, you're going to have all this punishment. Now let's look at some interesting punishments that we have here in the close of our class. Notice this in verse 29. And ye shall eat the flesh of your sons, and the flesh of your daughters shall ye eat. Wow. We've gone from this prosperity. I'm going to be fruitful. I'm going to run off all these people if they're chasing me. Now this is going to come to pass. Let's flip over to 2 Kings. Again, I'm excited to get into the study of 2 Kings and these nations being divided. So we're going to kind of talk about some of this. Again, repetition. You'll hear these things. You'll hear them back again. Notice in 2 Kings chapter 6, looking there in verse 26, and as the king of Israel, now the king of Israel here is the 10 northern tribes, Israel and Judah have separated, and the king of Israel was passing by upon the wall, where there cried a woman unto him, saying, Help my lord, O king. Notice verse 27. He said, If the Lord do not help thee, whence shall I help thee? Out of the barn floor, or out of the winepress? And the king said unto her, What aileth thee? And she answered, This woman said unto me, Give thy son, that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow. So we boiled my son, and did eat him. And I said unto her, On the next day, Give thy son, that we may eat him. And she hath hid her son. So this is when Syria is besieging Samaria. So again, Syria, Samaria, Israel. When we're looking at this, that the besiegement, those of us who are history nerds or history buffs, if you want to say it a little better like that, they would get around and they would build these embankments around the city. Nothing's coming in, nothing's coming out. So they would essentially starve them out if they were able to maintain their army. So Syria is besieging Samaria, and just as Moses told them back in Leviticus, right, we're on Mount Sinai, they're not even nowhere close to going into the promised land. He says, if you don't follow me, what's going to happen? You're going to eat your children. And we find that happening again in 2 Kings chapter 6. Now, Lamentations chapter 2 and verse 20, when Jeremiah is writing the book of Lamentations. So again, we think of lament, Lamentations. When he's writing this, Lamentations chapter 2, verse 20. Now this is going to be for Jerusalem there in Judah. Lamentations chapter 2, verse 20. Behold, O Lord, and consider to whom thou hast done this. Shall the women eat their fruit, and children of a span long? Shall the priest and the prophet be slain in the sanctuary of the Lord? They ate their children. Now, not only that, but in AD 70, when Rome is besieging Jerusalem, we find this event happening as well. That individuals were starving, and essentially that's what happened to the Jews, that the Romans starved them out. And when they got over one wall, they just went in, and they finally tore the whole city apart. And where Jesus prophesied, not one stone will be left upon another, the Romans were angry when they got into Jerusalem, and they found many people died of starvation, eating their children. So think about that. But what we find is, God says, if you do this, right, if you turn from me, this is what's going to happen. This came true. Now, in verse 31 of Leviticus, we find in Leviticus 26, it says, Your cities shall be laid waste. So again, they're going to destroy all of this. So we go to Jeremiah. So when we look at these, again, the prophecies are wonderful. Many people today, unfortunately, they get hung up on the prophecies and say, oh, this is happening in 2023 or 2024, excuse me. No, it happened back then. So we can get the context of what's going on. It helps you to determine these. So Jeremiah chapter 19, looking there, 6 through 9. Again, the idea of being left desolate. Now this is interesting. Therefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that the place shall no more be called Topheth. So they're in the valley of Hinnom, nor the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. And I will make void the counsel of Judah and Jerusalem in the place. And I will cause them to fall by the sword before their enemies, and the hands of them that seek their lives, and their carcasses will fall I give to be meat for the fowls of the heaven and for the beasts of the earth. I will make this city desolate. Now he's talking about Jerusalem. He's going to make that city desolate, and a hissing, right? A whistling that everyone that passeth by shall be astonished and hiss because of all the plagues thereof. This is amazing when you look at Jeremiah, because that's what he's doing. If you recall back, the valley of Hinnom, that's where they would sacrifice children to Baal. They would have, or not Baal, Moloch. They would have that he had like a man's body with the head of a bull, and he'd have his outstretched arms, Molech, and they would sacrifice their children in the valley of Hinnom. And that's what Christ uses to describe hell. He says, all right, they burned garbage in that valley after they abolished the child sacrifices. But when he talks about the fire that dies not, he's talking about that ever-burning garbage dump of the city of Jerusalem, the wailing and gnashing of teeth, the children being sacrificed on Moloch there in the valley of Hinnom. So Jeremiah takes the elders out there and says, this is what God's fixing to do to the city. He takes the clay pots and he breaks them. He says, that's what's going to happen to the city. The city's going to be desolate. But what we find when we get into that study is that the people in Jerusalem are like, no, we've got the temple, right? We've got temple. God's not going to do anything to us. We've got the temple. We find he lays waste to that place once by Babylon and twice by the Romans. Now, being left desolate, their cities are going to be laid waste. And then we find there again in Jeremiah chapter 25, looking there in verse 11, that the city would be desolate, right? It would be just a horrible place to be. Reading there in verse 11, and this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Now, that's important when we get into this. So we got just a little bit of time. I'm going to slow down just a little bit, but let's look at this, right? This land is going to be desolate. This is what Jeremiah is prophesying against. You will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Now, let's look at this for just a moment. Let's go to, we're going to talk about the 70 years. Let's look at the idea of the land enjoying its Sabbath. So that's what we find in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 34. So let's go back to 2 Chronicles 36 for just a moment. Again, you're going to have to stay with me because there's going to be a lot of stuff that's going to be neat popping up here at one time. 2 Chronicles 36, looking there in verse 21, talking about the Sabbaths. 2 Chronicles 36, this is towards the end here, verse 21, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. Notice, until the land hath enjoyed her Sabbath, for as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So, if you were here in the on Wednesday night, again, you got to be here on Wednesday night, right? All this stuff tying together. What we found is that they were supposed to let the land rest. They were supposed to have this sabbatical year in order to let the land rest. But Israel, out of their greed, they said, no, we're not going to let the land rest. In order to do that, they said, God's going to prosper us and we're going to be able to make it through. But no, they don't let it do that. So what we find is, because Israel would not follow all that and follow the commandments of God, they're going into Babylonian captivity. He said, I'm going to let the land rest for 70 years, make up for all of the Sabbath that you didn't let the land rest. Now let's go to Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9. So they're in Babylonian captivity here. They're going to go away. King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel chapter 9. Looking there in verse 2. And what do we find? In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books. So he's going back and reading these things. By the books, the number of the years whereof the word of the Lord came to who? Jeremiah, the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolation of Jerusalem. So when you read Daniel, and this helps tremendously, when you begin to look at the prophecies of Daniel, he's saying, all right, the 70 years, we've been in bondage. How long? God said 70 years. He's reading the prophet Jeremiah. He says, all right, we're about to depart, right? We're about to leave this place because God said 70 years. That's how long the land had to lay desolate. So, those who were left alive there would be in constant fear again there, and they could not stand again. Looking back at Leviticus 26:37. So that's wonderful to me. And again, you look at the idea of Babylon when you read Daniel, and that's how you can kind of tell. Because when you begin to read the beginning of Daniel, you read about Nebuchadnezzar. He's the Babylonian king, and then you read a little further in there, and you'll hear about Darius. He's the Mede. He's going to come in, and he's going to destroy that people as well. Thought I had that in a note, but I guess I don't. Maybe I've got it later on. All right. So let's look at one more thing here as we close. Verse 40, going back to Leviticus chapter 26, 40 through 46. It says, if you follow me and do what I tell you to do, I'm going to make you prosperous. If you don't, all of these things are going to happen. And we find that they do came to pass. Verses 40 through 46, but, again, if they confess their iniquity, right? If they are humbled and accept their iniquity, verse 41, then, notice, then God would remember his covenant. So what we have here, it says, again, it's what Daniel's essentially doing there. He knows the time's up. He says, we've got to get ready. We've got to repent of the sin that's in our lives. And what we find, notice there in Leviticus 26, and this is important. Leviticus 26, looking there as we're closing out here. It'll be the last point. Notice verses 45 or 44 and 45. And yet for all that when they be in the land of the enemies, so again, in captivity, I will not cast them away. So these people are carried away into Babylonian captivity. We have Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Obadiah, the three Hebrew youths there. But anyway, we find those individuals carried away. He says, I will not cast them away, neither will I abhor them, to destroy them utterly. So the Israelites weren't destroyed utterly, and to break my covenant with them, for I, the Lord their God. But I will, for their sakes, remember the covenant of their ancestors, whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt into the sight of the heathen, that I might be their God, and I am the Lord. There's a faithful remnant. So what we have to understand here, guys, is when we're going through this, that there's always this remnant that's going to be upon them. Now notice, let's go to 2 Chronicles 36. And we'll end, I've been saying that the whole time, but we're already getting to the end. 2 Chronicles 36. There's a remnant. They're going to come back. Now, those who are here on Sunday morning, you're about to get into Ezra and Nehemiah. Notice this. 2 Chronicles 36, beginning there in verse 22. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Now that's significant because we've had Babylonian captivity. We're going to look at that here in just a moment. Babylonian captivity. Now we have a Persian ruling, that the word of the Lord spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished. The Lord stirred up that he might make a proclamation throughout all of his kingdom and put it also into writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth hath the Lord God of heaven given me, and he hath charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judea. Who is there among you of all his people? The Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. So they've been carried away into Babylonian captivity. Now we have Cyrus being here saying, if you want to go back home, go back home. Israel, you can go back home. Notice there, whoever is among all of his people, go back. You get to go back. And I don't have the slide here, but I'll try to get it. You have the Cyrus cylinder that's been found. It's discovered. It's a great artifact. There's a replication in Memphis there in the library. But it's written in all these different languages, and they gave them this scroll type thing. And they said, all right, you go back home. If anybody stops you on the way, you have permission. But what's amazing is you look at Ezra, just look over the next page in your Bible. Now, we read in verse 22 of 2 Chronicles, now the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Look at chapter 1, verse 1 of Ezra. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stood up the spirit of King Cyrus, king of Persia, that he might make a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it also in writing, saying. We have the same thing. When you pick up in Ezra on the Sunday morning class here in a few weeks, this is where you're at. They've gone into Babylonian captivity. They're coming out. They're able to go back home. Now, they're going to build the temple, and that's what they will be teaching you. Mr. Harold, Mr. Brad, talking about the idea. They're going to rebuild the wall. They're going to rebuild the temple. So here's where we're at. So just right here, let's notice this. Jeremiah chapter, again, the idea, well, where do we get the Persians, right? We were in Babylon. Now we've got the Persians. Jeremiah chapter 25. What about these individuals coming in? So again, we hear all these names. Now notice this. There's Jeremiah 25, verse 12. And it shall come to pass when 70 years are accomplished, that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, saith the Lord, for their iniquity, and the land of the Chaldees, and I will make it perpetual desolations. So from Jeremiah 25, I'm going to raise up Babylon. They're going to destroy you, but I'm going to raise up someone to destroy Babylon, and that's Cyrus. He's going to be that man. So in Daniel chapter 5, looking quickly here, Daniel chapter 5, just so you can make the notes and you can go back and look at this. Daniel chapter 5, we made the note there. You hear these different kings. In verse 30 of Daniel chapter 5, and in the night when Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, or Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So this is where we find Nebuchadnezzar, his son Belshazzar. He's going to be hosting this feast, the handwriting on the wall. The Medes come in. So then you've probably heard me talk about the Medo-Persian Empire. This is where we get it. So, and then in Daniel chapter 10, and this is my last point, Daniel chapter 10, verse 1, we find in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel. So we find his name there, Belteshazzar, not Belshazzar. So when you read Daniel, and again, I know people get hung up on Daniel. They're like, oh, Daniel, he's talking about today. No, he's not. You can look back, and again, when you look at the chapters, usually it's in the year, because you can go to 11, and you're in the year of Darius the Mede. In 10, you're in the 30 year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So it's important when you read Daniel, when you go through that, to know who's the king, what events are happening. You're under Babylonian captivity. You're soon going to be under the Medo-Persians, and you're going to be sent back home by Cyrus, back to Jerusalem. Ezra and Nehemiah is where we find that. So, any questions or comments about any of that? I know that was a lot. Anything there? All right. Lord willing, again, we won't be here next Sunday, but Lord willing, next week or the week after next, we're going to kind of be looking at the division of the kingdom, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. So if you have some questions about that, we'll be covering that, the evil kings of the north and the not so good, sometimes good kings of the south. So we'll be kind of getting into some of that. But anyway, a little bit there of some prophecy. Hope to get into a little bit more of that, Lord willing. Anybody got anything left?